Part 2. Schooldays, Bruges. It took a considerable time for the sale of Parkenver to be completed. During the delay, my mother decided that my sister and I must go abroad to learn languages, particularly French, and that it must be to a place where my sister could have really good violin lessons. My mother was obsessed with the idea that my sister was a musical genius and that no competent tuition could be obtained in Cornwall. A girlhood friend of hers had married a Mr. Ellis, an artist, and they had gone to Bruges for their children's education, so she wrote to Mrs. Ellis, asking what she thought of Bruges as an educational centre. Mrs. Ellis replied that she thought it was good. There was a Protestant school there and an excellent violin master who had been a pupil of the celebrated Belgian violinist Isai. She had found that living was cheap and the only thing that worried her was the French language. My mother felt that this would not worry her. She was very proud of her French and soon decided that Bruges was the place for us, much to the dismay of our Cornish relatives who were shocked at the idea of my sister becoming a professional musician. But my mother adhered to her decision and, after much delay, she and her young daughters set out for Belgium, burdened with much unnecessary luggage. In spite of being so narrow that the French call it La Manche, the English Channel can be one of the most turbulent and unpleasant strips of water in the world. It was her first sea voyage, and my poor mother soon discovered that she was a very poor sailor. I am not a bad sailor myself, but I do not enjoy the sea when it is rough. My sister proved to be as good a sailor as my mother was bad. While my mother was down in the stuffy cabin feeling that she wanted to die, and I was not feeling very happy in a chair on deck, my sister explored the little packet boat. The more it wallowed, the more she enjoyed it. When we reached Ostend, a swarm of porters rushed on board, shouting and gesticulating. They had numbered discs on their blue uniforms. Number 14 saw me in a chair on deck, sitting beside a pile of hand luggage, upon which he swooped and started to put a thick strap through all the handles preparatory to taking it to the customs. Not having the least idea of his intentions, I jumped from my chair and seized the other end of the strap, shrieking "Nong" in my best French. The more he pulled, the more I pulled, and, the more he shouted, the more I shrieked. My sister heard the noise and came running to my aid, but as her French was no better than mine, she only added to the turmoil. Then my mother, white and shaken, appeared on deck and entered the fray. She was quite sure that she fully understood French, having a framed examination certificate to support her confidence. She soon discovered that having once known how to translate "Have you a pen?" "No, but I have the dirty socks of the gardener," or "The canary has fallen into the fire." "Hark, how it crackles," was little help when dealing with an excited Belgian porter. The latter went on pouring out a torrent of French of which my mother did not understand a word, but she was determined not to give the fact away to her children and nodded her head and said "we" every now and then. Then the porter said something about the police and I wondered what was going to happen. At that moment a nice Englishman came to the rescue. "Madam," he said, "perhaps you find Belgian French rather difficult to understand. May I act as interpreter? The porter is asking you whether you have any contraband goods in your luggage, such as brandy, tea, matches or new clothes." My mother was horrified and assured him that she had nothing of the sort, not even the tea, which she had been sorely tempted to bring. But the porter was not easily satisfied. He said that Madame had repeatedly assured him she had brandy and tea and many new garments, and he had threatened to call the police, because she said she knew that they were contraband. However, he suddenly changed his tune. My sister told me afterwards that she saw the kind gentleman give him something, which she thought was money. Anyway, our new friend walked to the customs house with us and explained everything to the customs officer, who seemed to know him quite well and called him Milor over and over again. Finally we got into the right train for Bruges. We never saw our kind friend again, which, I thought, was a pity. We found Mrs. Ellis waiting for us at the station. She then took us to the Hotel du Sablon, where we stayed until we could rent a flat. At last we found one in the same street as the hotel, over a poultry and game shop. The proprietor was the best chef in Bruges, so we went down to his little restaurant for our meals and thought his cooking delicious. A favorite dish of his was jugged hare, and it was a favorite of ours too, until one day when Mother was telling Mr. Ellis about it and he laughed and said, "What you eat, Mrs. Penrose, isn't hare, for hares are very hard to get hereabouts. It's cat. Nobody in Bruges can keep a cat, but someone is sure to steal it and turn it into jugged hare. Nothing would ever induce me to eat jugged hare again." It was a nice large flat, quite close to the big square, La Grande Place, with its celebrated belfry, and my mother was pleased at finding a place where she could have a piano for playing my sister's accompaniments. Mrs. Ellis was most kind in doing all she could to help my mother, and had arranged for me to attend the Protestant school where her own children went. It was a Lutheran school, particularly narrow and bigoted in its teaching. On my first day I was taken with several other girls to the headmistress's study to be interviewed and questioned. She was quite nice to some of the older girls, but, when it came to my turn, I could feel one of those strange waves of distrust and dislike coming over me, which I have had all my life. I knew she disliked me as much as I disliked her, and from that moment she never lost an opportunity of holding me up to ridicule in front of a class. One of her pet tricks was to make fun of the English girls' accents and pronunciations of French, and it annoyed her exceedingly that she could not do so with me because my gift of mimicry enabled me to imitate anybody's French. But there were two subjects in which I was always in trouble: spelling and mathematics. She often turned up at the spelling class and, when there was some difficult word to spell, she would interrupt the class to say, "Wait, if you please. Petite Penroseville spells that," which, of course, Petite Penrose couldn't do. In maths I was always at the bottom of the class and stayed there because I could not go any lower. Matters soon reached a crisis and my bête noire got the opportunity for which she was waiting. A very young and sanctimonious mistress was giving us a scripture lesson on the first chapter of Genesis and telling us that the world was created in 7 days. I had always been as interested in the inside of the earth as I was in the stars. Shortly before this disastrous lesson, my mother had taken my sister and I to tea at the Ellises. Mr. Ellis's younger brother, who was a noted geologist, had come over from England and was paying them a short visit. After tea, my mother and Mrs. Ellis were absorbed in some new kind of needlework, and my sister had gone off with the 2 elder Ellis children, and I was left in the drawing room, sitting alone on the window seat. Young Mr. Ellis was talking to his brother about a recent geological discovery and, although I could understand but little of it, I listened with absorbed attention. Presently the elder Mr. Ellis went away and the geologist came and sat beside me. "Well, little lady," he said, "were you interested in what I was saying? You seem to be sitting awfully still, so I thought you must be." "Yes, I was," I replied, "but I can't think how you can know so much about the inside of the earth and what it must look like down there." So he explained how the earth was built up gradually and was rather like a cake with layers in different colors piled on top of each other. He went on to say that it had taken a very long time to do. I asked him how that could be because the Bible said that the world was made in 6 days and that God was so tired that he had to rest on the 7th day. He smiled and said, "Our day isn't the same as the Bible day. We have only 24 hours in our day, but what is called a day in Genesis is quite different. Geologists call it a period, and that means thousands, and even millions, of years." This was an entirely new idea to me, so I said quickly, "But God did make it, didn't he?" I was terribly afraid that he was going to say that God hadn't made the world, and that would have been dreadful. In those days I looked upon God as a very great personal friend who could do anything and who knew everything. So when the geologist, as I called him, said, "Of course God made it. That is why it is so wonderfully and perfectly made," I felt very relieved and glad. Unfortunately, my mother came across the room at that moment and said to young Mr. Ellis that she was afraid that I had been a great nuisance in keeping him talking so long and that she must apologize for me. But Mr. Ellis said that he was very fond of children and was sure that my mother must be pleased at having such an intelligent little daughter. But my mother wasn't a bit pleased, for she didn't approve of my taking an interest in such silly things. So I was taken home, rather in disgrace. But my inside me was very happy because I had heard so many interesting things about how the earth was made, and I was longing to show off my new knowledge to the girls at school. Every week we had a scripture lesson, and Miss Simpson, the English mistress, used to give it. She always took the lesson from the Old Testament, which amused the elder Mr. Ellis when his children told him about it, because he said that he would like to hear what she had to say about King Solomon and his columbines. Mrs. Ellis got quite cross with him and told him to be quiet, but I couldn't see why, because at Park Henver we used to have great beds of columbines in the summer and everyone said how lovely they were. I had to wait for my chance of showing off until the beginning of the following term when Miss Simpson said that she was going to start at the first chapter of Genesis and work right through the Bible, which, I felt, would take rather a long time. She then read from the Big Bible, which she always used, how God created the world in 6 days and rested on the seventh. I quickly got to my feet and put up my hand and said, "Please, Miss Simpson, the world wasn't made in 7 days, because the Bible day doesn't mean our sort of day. It means a period, and that is probably thousands of." Before I could say any more, Miss Simpson turned on me in a fury. "What did you say, Petite Penrose? I cannot believe my ears. Do you dare to get up and say that the Bible, God's holy book, isn't true? It is too terrible to be believed. Sit down. Sit down at once. I never heard anything so awful in my life." By then, all the other children in the class were looking horrified and rather frightened, and, as anyone can catch fear just as they can catch measles, I began to feel frightened, too, though I couldn't imagine why Miss Simpson should be so angry, when I had only repeated what the geologist had told me. When the bell rang for the end of the class, Miss Simpson bolted from the room, but was soon back with a scarlet face. She almost spat the words out at me. "You are to go to Madam this minute, you horrible, wicked little girl. This minute. Do you hear?" I was always highly strung and easily frightened, and to be sent to the headmistress in disgrace was a terrifying thing to happen to any child. So I was shaking all over and close to tears when I knocked at Madam's door. I heard a loud entree and went in. Madame Bernard, always known simply as Madam, was seated at her desk with a Bible open before her. As I stood in front of her, she gave me a look which might well have frightened me, so full was it of spite and hate. With a sort of horrible pleasure she said, "So, Mademoiselle, you are not only a stupid and objectionable pupil, but a wicked, blasphemous little heathen as well. To think that you should dare to get up before a whole class of pure and holy children and say that the word of God which is in his own holy book, each and every word of which he wrote himself, is untrue, is so terrible that I can hardly believe it. What have you to say for yourself?" Madame's English was most fluent and she was very proud of it, but her pronunciation was so thick and bad it was often unintelligible. Her protruding eyes glared at me as she sat like a cat with a cornered mouse. I only said, "Madam," I began, with tears streaming down my face, "what a big Joel just told me." But I got no further. "Do you mean to tell me that your mover, who calls herself a Christian woman, allowed a heretic to talk to you? She should indeed be ashamed. She is unfit to have had child n. And, as for you, Mademoiselle, God will pour the vials of his wrath on you and it will kill you, yes, kill you. But listen," and she rapidly turned over the leaves of the Bible, until she found what she wanted, and went on. "The holy book says the prayer of the righteous man availeth much. You do not deserve that I pray for you, but still I will. Kneel down, while I pray." When she said the vials of his wrath, it sounded like the vowels of his woe, and I hadn't the faintest idea what she was talking about, except that she was saying that God, who was my good, kind friend, was going to do something horrible to me, if she didn't stop him. So I got all hot and angry inside, for I was sure it wasn't true, though I didn't dare say so. So I stopped crying and peeped at her through my fingers. And there she was with crocodile tears running down her face, telling God how he made the world and how long it took and begging him not to hurt me, which I felt was terribly silly. Perhaps she felt that she wasn't frightening me as much as she hoped, for she got up and said, "Stand the other side of my desk. Mademoiselle, while I write to your mover, commanding her to come here tomorrow at 2 o'clock, and you will come too." Then she sat down to write, and I thought what an ugly, fat old woman she really was, with her red eyes and untidy hair, and I wondered how I had ever been afraid of her. Her hand was shaking so much that she could hardly write, and a large tear splashed onto the paper and spoilt the letter. She looked so comical I had to cram my wet handkerchief into my mouth to stop myself laughing. All the time she was writing she was muttering in French. I could, generally, understand her, whether she spoke in English or French, but she was so angry she said a lot of things which I couldn't understand at all. When the letter was finished, ordering my mother to come to the school next day, I couldn't help thinking that my mother wouldn't like being ordered, as she always did the ordering herself. I was dismissed and told to take the letter home and give it to my mother at once. When my mother got the letter she said that she was entirely mystified and I had to explain as best I could. As I had expected, she was very much annoyed and I felt that this part of the row was going to be the worst of all, for when my mother got really angry she became very quiet and terrifying. "Really, Maud," she said, "you are a most tiresome child. I am extremely annoyed that Madame Bernard has seen fit to order me to go and see her tomorrow, and I am afraid that I shall hear that you have been very rude, which will force me to punish you, too. What does she mean when she says that she prayed for you to save you? To save you from what? I really do not understand at all." Then, with a strange intuition for self-preservation which children often have, I said, "But, Mother, Madame prayed for you too and said awful things about you. She said that you, who called yourself a Christian woman, should be ashamed of yourself for allowing a heathen man to terminate your children and that you should never have had children at all and that God would pour the bowels of his wrath on you, too." "The what?" said my mother, in absolute horror. "My dear child, what are you talking about?" However, she apparently thought it wiser not to investigate further at the moment. "Anyway," she said, "we will go tomorrow and I will hear what this impertinent Frenchwoman has to say." Then I felt safe, for I saw that mother's anger had shifted to Madame. Next day we arrived at the school at 2 o'clock. My mother was wearing one of her best dresses, with a little train, which made her look much taller and very dignified. When we were shown into Madame's study, an old clergyman, a Mr. Law, was sitting in a big armchair, with Madame standing over him, talking very loud and waving her hands about. When Madame saw my mother, she tried to appear calm and said in her ugly English, "You will be pleased to be seated, Madame. I fear this is a terrible day for you to find what a vict, blasphemous child you avenue I say, with much pain, Madame Penrose, that a child, who is so wicked as to say that the holy word of God is untrue, is not fit for my very select school, because she will soil the characters of the pure and holy children which I have in my care." My mother sat perfectly straight and still in her chair and watched her with a cold, unmoved stare. To cover her discomfort, Madame started talking louder and louder and her face got redder and redder and uglier. She looked so silly and untidy, that I again wondered how I could ever have been afraid of her. Then Madame turned to Mr. Law. "Is it not correct, Mr. Law, that this vict girl will soil the characters of the pure and holy children in my school?" Mr. Law, who was very old and shaky, had gone to sleep, but he woke with a start when Madame addressed him. Yes, of course. Of course. I quite agree," then went off to sleep again, though how he could sleep with that dreadful voice shouting near him, I couldn't understand. "I have prayed for Madame Penrose," she went on, "that God will spare otherwise he would have poured the vowels of his wrath upon her." My mother almost smiled at the word vowels. "May I ask you to repeat that, Madame Bernard, as what you have said is an absurdity and has no meaning at all." Then Madame completely lost control of herself and tears of rage, as well as of pious horror, ran down her face. Madame Penrose was questioning her English. That she would not have. She burst out. "Madame, you are as much to blame as your vict child. God will punish you too for allowing a vict heathen man to talk heresy to a child." She then became hysterical and shrieked, "I will not have this child in my school. You must remove her at once. I expel her. Do you hear, Madame Penrose? I expel her. She shall never blacken my doors again." Then turning to Mr. Law, who was peacefully slumbering, she shouted, "Am I not right, Mr. Law? She must go at once, and I say at once." Then seeing, that the old man was still asleep, she bellowed in his ear, "Mr. Law, Mr. Law. I demand that you pronounce the judgment, now. At that he woke with a start and stammered. Yes, of course. I quite agree, and sat blinking like an owl disturbed in daylight. My mother then rose slowly to her feet. She was very small, but she seemed to have grown inches in the last few minutes. She looked Madame slowly up and down. I am more horrified than I can say, Madame Bernard, to think that I entrusted my little daughter to the care of an hysterical woman, utterly devoid of self-restraint or manners. You are correct in saying that my daughter shall never darken your doors again. Also, I do not wish her to have such an absurd and garbled account of the Bible and religion as I have had to listen to today. Her eyes were like steel and her voice small and icy. By this time the old clergyman began to realize that he had given his consent to something which he knew nothing about, so he started to say something to my mother. But she would have none of it. Your verdict, Mr. Law, might have carried some weight, if you had some idea of what was in question, instead of being asleep all the time. But to constitute yourself a judge and pronounce a verdict in such circumstances is a disgrace to you as a man and to your cloth as a clergyman. Then, signing to me to follow her, she sailed out of the room. End of Part 2.